Thank you so much. It's an honor, as always, to be invited to Lublin, also to virtually this time. I hope you can hear me, and I will share some slides. These are in a very rough state because I was not planning to share many of them, and some of them are actually in Polish. I tried to do my best, but I cheated, you will see. So to explain the title, I hope it was catchy enough. Of course, it's a reference to the Star Wars universe, but actually, this is something that we see today. Basically, what I had in mind in the past few weeks that we have been watching the rules-based world order as we know it since 1945 basically crumble before our own very eyes. I think there is a consensus that the world order as we know it is changing. But I think we should clarify what do we mean by the world order and what do we mean by change and since when it's happening. I think that what we see today is really dramatic, but it's actually just speeding up a process which had been in the making for several years now. And actually what I see in the changes in the system of sovereigns is basically a reaction from the wielders of state power. It's not an action itself, it's a reaction to several changes. Because the world order, I believe, is an order of sovereign entities. When we speak about the world order, we speak about the relation between states. And that's the traditional way of thinking since the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. That's why this system is very often described as the Westphalian system. This has been in constant change in the past 300 years. And these changes present themselves in two different settings. First and foremost, the sovereign system or the system of sovereigns was changing because the sovereign itself, the sovereign entity, has changed very much in the past 300 years. In the 17th century, at the origins of this system, sovereign meant exclusively the monarch, the king, rarely the queen. And the king was the sovereign. As Louis XIV's Bomo goes, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. Actually, he never said that, but it's a very good saying, and that's a very famous saying. He could have said that, because he was really holding all the power that we today attribute to the state. And there were those changes within the sovereign, within the state itself. Louis XIV had been not ruling citizens, he was ruling over subjects. People had no right, no legal standing against their sovereign domestically, at home. And this has changed since the French Revolution. In the 19th century, we had seen Europe in turmoil, people fighting for their rights against their state. And we became citizens. So the sovereigns have changed very much. But this was not the only reason and the only setting where the world order, the sovereign order has been changing. Because among the sovereigns at a higher level, outside the external dimension of sovereignty, has also changed. But this change is not so obvious. To apprehend this interstate change, we need to focus on how international law has changed. The legal regulation existing among sovereign entities. I know there are very many cynical attitudes toward international law, claiming that it does not exist or it's just one-armed giant, if a giant at all. But actually, international law has always existed when there were more than two sovereign entities together. But the actual contents of international law for many thousands of years was limited to regulating the relations of these sovereigns. So basically, in simple plain English, two sovereign entities, two kings, were fighting a war against each other. One of them gained some territories, the other lost it, and in the end they sat down and wrote a peace treaty about this. And that was the basic tenet of international law. But there was also the peaceful part. Merchants traveling around the world, and they needed regulations. So international law was more than just peace treaties. But in the 19th century, parallel to the changes going on within the states, international law also evolved. Let's say changed. I think it's evolution, but some may find it a not so beneficial process. I think it was beneficial. International law started to regulate new technical cooperations in telecommunications, in transport, in trade, but also it placed several very strong constraints, limits, checks and balances on the political power of sovereign entities. Sovereign entities could not just do anything that they wanted to do. And I think the past 25 years has brought along another kind of change within international law. Until the mid-1960s, 1970s, international law was evolving in terms of substantive rights and obligations. For those of you who are not lawyers, possibly, when I speak about substantive rights and obligations, answers to the question, what are my rights? What are my obligations? And that's all. I do not speak about how do I enforce them? What do I do to exercise my rights? This is the procedural part. And in the past 25 years, international law has made major breakthroughs in these areas. Accountability options have been enhanced, or even new options have emerged the field. In the early 1990s, if a dictator violated international law, invaded a neighboring country, there was only one thing for him to be afraid of, and that was the United Nations Security Council, which is a political decision-making body. So if he had friends in the UN Security Council, permanent members, or it was one of the permanent members, that political leader could be pretty sure about the fact that nobody is going to be able to touch him in a legal sense. He enjoyed immunity against other courts, against other states' courts. There was no international court at the time, and the Security Council veto power could block anything. But in 2002, the International Criminal Court entered the picture. 1 year before that, much more subtly, 2001, the articles on the responsibility of states for international wrongful acts. Sorry, it's a long title. Basically, it's a draft articles on state responsibility, a draft treaty on state responsibility has been accepted by the United Nations International Law Commission. This is the codification of customary international law as we have known it at that time. But it had a new element, which was not customary. A new element which said that in case of a major violation, it's not just one state, the injured state, against the wrongful state. In case of a serious violation of international law, it's one state, the injured state, supported by every other state against the wrongful state. Meaning every other state has a right or actually a duty to act, to impose countermeasures against the wrongful state. What I'm speaking about now is basically the legal foundations, international legal foundations of the sanctions against Russia. However, this legal title is not often mentioned. So we have these new options. And actually, all these developments in accountability under international law were pointing toward a situation where I'm trying to phrase it politely, but there is no other way around it. The power of state leaders have faced new limits imposed on them by the international community of states, their own states included. But decision makers do not necessarily like the idea to be limited in their field of action. So we started to see a reaction from states. I would just cite two of these, two slogans. One of them would be obviously, let's take back control. The slogan behind the Leave campaign in Brexit. Take back control from whom? That's a good question. From the outside, from the external entities, from the others, from the not us. And of course, there is another slogan which tries to capture that we should focus on ourselves. We are the important and nobody else. So we should make America great again. And this taking back control, this inward looking, naturally takes the form of a very simplistic message. The simplistic message is we feel the limits on our power from the outsiders, because these outsiders impose regulations on us. So if we diminish the number of international obligations, heaven is going to come to earth. I'm going to give you anything, my loyal citizens. Just help me get rid of these constraints, and then I will change your life for the better. That's the political message, very simply put. But actually there is one or two factors, two whole dimensions, which is omitted from these arguments. As I have told you, diminishing the number of obligations in international law would only impact one aspect of how the world order has changed. It would only change the interstate aspect. What about the domestic effect, the domestic aspect? Domestically speaking, we hold fundamental rights. We have the freedom of speech that I actually exercise right now at this moment, and I'm very proud to do it. But where do I exercise my right to freedom of expression? Currently, I am sitting in Hungary. I'm doing so under the Hungarian constitution, or should we take into consideration the Polish constitution? Because most of my dear audience now is listening to this speech from Poland, or from Ukraine, or from England, or from the United States. I don't know. Which constitution should apply to my freedom of expression and to your freedom of expression to debate everything that I say? We cannot do this domestically, not in the 21st century. It's not just one constitution. So whenever we start to meddle with international obligations of the states, that will have an implication on our rights domestically, because these rights are not dictated from outside substantively. What comes from the outside, actually, all these rights that I'm speaking about now, constitutional rights, have been imported to international law from the constitutions. The source is domestic law. The target is international law. The novelty, the plus element of international law, is enforcement mechanism against the state. European Court of Human Rights, United Nations Human Rights Committees in Geneva, these are the new elements. So when someone tries to get rid of obligations, it's either to turn back on constitutional rights, I've never heard that from a politician so far, or to turn back on enforcement mechanisms. But why should we turn back on enforcement mechanism if we otherwise respect the rights? And there is one more element, a third element that I have not yet mentioned so far in the changes of world order. There is a new kid on the block. There is a new sheriff in town, I would say. New actors emerged in international law. A few years ago, more than a few years ago, let's say in our childhoods, 30, 40 years ago, if we could not have this conference without state support. I could not come to speak in Poland without having a passport. You could not even invite me without sending me a letter with a postmark on it, with a stamp on it, without the state assisting us in this communication. And there are so many examples like this, where we don't need the state any longer. We, the human beings, obtained the ability to contact each other, to build communities with each other, bypassing the state structures. And these new structures have evolved into something that we call non-state actors. And it's not just only in innocent things like getting invited to a brilliant workshop like this. Terrorist organizations are attacking the state, and the states are fighting back with private military corporations. The value of money is not just GDP. It can be granted by something called blockchain technology, where the state is lagging behind. So the world order of sovereigns have changed, in my understanding, in three aspects. First, within the states in terms of constitutional rights. Second, among the states in terms of the number of international obligations, and also in the quality of obligations. And third, but not least, the emergence of non-state actors. And from these non-state actors, the big tech are primarily important. One of the novel things that I have seen in the past few weeks or months is how this big tech is seemingly supporting the strengthening of sovereignty. That's one thing where I would pose a question for this workshop and for every other discussion I'm involved in. How genuine is this support? How far can it go? Is there really a joint interest between big tech and sovereign entities, or is there a conflict of interest? I think that's one of the interesting questions for the near future that we should keep an eye out for. And this all leads to my conclusions, because I don't want to hold you so far. And I was raising questions so far, so I try to describe how do I see the change of world order. And to sum it up, I see today that sovereign entities have been weakened by a different kind of international cooperation, which is closer to the people. Direct communication between individuals, bypassing state structures, that's a new thing. And if you like it, take it that way, states became jealous of power. And they try to take it back. And now this is the time for the empires to strike back. But what's the difference between an empire and a state? Not all states are empires, obviously. So I think the big question in the changes of the world order, our legal system, our international legal system, the world order, if you like it, is based upon a kind of fiction. This fiction is states are equal. Of course we are not equal. The the population, the territory of Poland compared to Hungary shows considerable differences. These differences are reflected in terms of economic power, in terms of soft power, in many other aspects. But the sovereignty of the states is what is considered equal. The capacity, the legal capacity to obtain rights and obligations, to decide over our future, over how we administer our own affairs, our own domestic affairs. Our very independence is in question. We have the right for this. There is a very famous judgment in international law, the Palmas Island Arbitration Award, which says that sovereignty signifies independence. In that aspect, if we have empires dictating what smaller states can and cannot do, the question that we should address, are we ready to give up this sovereignty defined in terms of independence? Because if we allow empires to do this, who will be big enough? What states would be big enough to dictate this future? For the time being, it says that as of March the 31st, 2025, there are 3 states which have the public and open inclination to do. China, which has the ability to do. Russia, which has the will to do, but I don't know if it has the capacity, only in terms of nuclear power, but not in any other term. And surprisingly, for the past 3 months, the United States, taking over Greenland, Panama, or at least inclining to take over Greenland and Panama. So what about the others? I think that is the question, and that is a really hard question. And I have, finally, in conclusion, I have a few answers. I have 2 answers based upon international law and international relations theory. What I suggest is an update to the hegemonic state theory. Hegemonic state theory basically claims that throughout the modern times, since the Peace Treaty of Westphalia, there was always one country, one great power, which had the ability and the inclination to, simply put, rule the world. France in the 17th century, 18th century, dominated European culture, world culture, not just in terms of military and economics, also culturally speaking. England in the 19th century, the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, and the United States since 1991, unilaterally, mostly by use of soft power. Why none of these powers became an overwhelming empire ruling all over the world? Well, the answer lies at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon almost made it, but then all the European powers cooperated against it. So hegemonic state theory, basically in one sentence, suggests that there will always be a state which is more powerful than the others. But there cannot be a situation, if you have a large enough number of states, then you cannot have a situation where one state is going to be stronger than all of the others combined. Now, the novelty that we see in the past few weeks is a new question. Can the US, China, and, as they wanted, Russia, divide the world against the will of all the other states combined? I don't think that the answer is affirmative. I think the answer is regionalism is going to be strengthened. European cohesion must be strengthened in order to withstand these new changes. Southeast Asian cooperation will emerge. Pacific cooperation will emerge to withstand these tendencies. That's one of my answers. The other answer is, another possible outcome comes from the non-state actors, which is really the black horse in this entire situation. We cannot know how and where it is going to move. But it may lead to a truly multipolar world where the power in terms of military, in politics, and economics would not point to the same hegemonic entity. It is possible that China is going to have the strongest army. The US is going to maintain the strongest political power, but the strongest economic power is going to be several corporations and not a state any longer. And because I'm also coming from a Catholic university, if you forgive me, I would also offer a few answers for the examination of the changes in the world order based upon Catholic social teaching. And that's where I wanted to cheat because I found the text in Polish. So I'm going to give you the English version, of course, because I don't dare to read. My Polish is simply not sufficient for that. So I would start with the Pacem in Terris encyclical letter, paragraph 131. It says that the prosperity and progress of any state is in part consequence and in part cause of the prosperity and progress of all other states. That's a recognition of interdependence among states. Focusing on one country cannot yield strong benefits, not even in the medium run. That's one of the observations. You can say it's too old, it's from the 1960s, but a more recent one from Pope Benedict, Caritas in Veritate, paragraph 67. He was one of the most radical popes in terms of international relations and international law observations, as far as I have read in the encyclicals. In this place, at paragraph 67, he wrote that there are some changes required. This interdependence, as it was recognized in Pacem in Terris, in the face of the unrelenting growth of global interdependence, there is a strongly felt need, even in the midst of global recession, for a reform of the United Nations, and likewise of other institutions. And now watch this. So that the concept of the family of nations can acquire real teeth. The original text was not so harsh, it's just the English translation. The Latin is a bit more lenient, but actually it speaks about giving power to international law. What was happening at the time? That's what I was referring to at the beginning of this short presentation. And the reason for this is one also senses the urgent need to find innovative ways of implementing the principle of the responsibility to protect and of giving poorer nations an effective voice in shared decision-making. I don't think that it points at all that empires are welcome back, according to Catholic social teaching. And last but not least, I would refer to two encyclicals from Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si. This text is actually in both texts. In Fratelli Tutti, you find it in 172. In Laudato Si, you find it at 175. And the text reads, the 21st century, while maintaining systems of governance inherited from the past, is witnessing a weakening of the power of nation states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, the big tech, being transnational, tends to prevail over the political. Given this situation, it is essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions. Again, back to finding peace. So basically, that concludes my short presentation, as much as conclusions can be done and can be said at this point. If I may use this final 10 seconds to advertise an ID, I am currently trying to form an informal group of Catholic international lawyers who try to interpret these phrases I've been doing in the end. If you are interested, please feel free to reach me out directly or by the organizers. Thank you so much for your and open for questions.